Picture this: a Chicago apartment above a discount store, a sheep-shaped stuffed toy sitting on a shelf, and two grown men about to launch into a chant-and-bounce routine that an entire generation can still perform from muscle memory. That's Perfect Strangers. 8 seasons, 150 episodes, and a cultural footprint way bigger than a show about a Wisconsin transplant and his cousin from a fictional Mediterranean island had any right to leave behind. From 1986 to 1993 on ABC, Bronson Pinchot played Balki Bartokomous, the wide-eyed shepherd who arrived in America convinced it was paradise, and Mark Linn-Baker played Larry Appleton, the anxious, ambitious cousin who thought he knew better. Together they built one of the most beloved odd couple pairings of the decade, a partnership so specific and so well-tuned that it's easy to forget how close the whole thing came to never happening in the form we remember it. Today we're counting down 15 facts about how this show came together almost by accident, survived a shaky start that would have sunk most series, and somehow ended up echoing through pop culture decades later, including a connection to one of HBO's darkest dramas that absolutely nobody watching in real time saw coming. We'll cover the recasting nobody talks about, the improvised bit that became the show's whole identity, and the reason a fictional island wound up serving the writers better than the real one ever could have. Let's get into it. Every good sitcom needs an aha moment, and for Perfect Strangers, that moment arrived courtesy of the 1984 Summer Olympics in Los Angeles. Producers Thomas Miller and Robert Boyette, working alongside creator Dale McCraven, spent that summer watching athletes from all over the world experience American life for the first time. The food, the customs, the sheer sensory overload of it all. Watching international athletes experience American life while in Los Angeles for the games got the team thinking about building a series around that kind of culture shock. The idea evolved fast, and it went through several early versions before landing somewhere nobody quite expected. The outsider stopped being an athlete and became an immigrant relative. The setting became a cramped Chicago apartment above a discount store. And the fish-out-of-water concept, instead of being played as a cynical culture clash, became something warmer. A character who found genuine wonder in things everyone else had stopped noticing. The noise, the food, the sheer pace of everyday American life. That contrast between Balki's fresh-eyed amazement and Larry's big-city exhaustion became the show's entire engine, and it worked for 8 years. It's worth pausing on how unusual that pitch was for the mid-1980s. Sitcoms of the era tended to build stories around workplace dynamics or family units that already existed, starting instead from a single cultural collision, and then working backward to figure out who these two people even were. Meant the writers had to invent an entire mythology from scratch. That gamble paid off, but it easily could have gone the other way. Here's a piece of trivia the show itself never advertised. Bronson Pinchot and Mark Linn-Baker are both Yale graduates, but they didn't overlap, and they didn't take the same path. Pinchot completed his undergraduate degree at Yale, majoring in theater. Linn-Baker went further, earning his MFA from a Yale School of Drama. Same institution. Two very different tracks through it, and neither man was originally slotted to end up sharing a Chicago apartment on network television. That theatrical training shows up constantly in the finished product. The show's slapstick could have easily felt sloppy or forced, but both actors brought a level of stage-honed timing that made even the broadest physical gags feel controlled, like two performers who instinctively knew exactly how far to push a bit before pulling back. Larry Appleton wasn't written as a hardened cynic. He was anxious, ambitious, and held together with optimism and not much else, which made him the perfect counterweight to Balki's total, unshakable faith in everything around him. It's a small detail, but it matters, because a huge amount of what made the show rewatchable came down to craft rather than luck. Two classically trained actors dropped into a broad physical comedy premise could have easily played it too big or too small. Instead, both of them found a register that let the show swing from quiet character beats to full chaos and back again within a single scene, often within a single line. Before Larry Appleton existed as we know him, there was Cousin Louie, played by stand-up comedian Louie Anderson. In this earlier, more cynical version of the pilot, Anderson appeared opposite Pinchot's Balki, but producers felt the chemistry wasn't landing, so Anderson was let go. An entire pilot had already been shot before the decision was made to start over. After auditioning several replacements, The producers settled on Linn-Baker, who they'd just seen in a guest appearance on Moonlighting. The chemistry clicked immediately, and the show was retooled around the new pairing, proof that sometimes the version audiences fell in love with only exists because an earlier version quietly didn't work. Anderson, of course, went on to have an entirely separate and hugely successful career of his own. So this isn't a story about a bad performer landing in the wrong role. It's a story about two very different comic sensibilities that simply didn't sync. Anderson's stand-up persona was built on a very different rhythm than the physical, theatrical-style Pinchot brought to Balki, and the mismatch was apparently obvious enough on screen that the producers scrapped a finished pilot rather than push forward with something that wasn't quite working. That's a genuinely rare move for a network in the middle of a tight production schedule, which says something about how strongly they believed in the underlying concept, even when the first execution of it fell flat. Most new shows get a full fall rollout, with months of promotion. Perfect Strangers got something much riskier, a mid-season tryout. ABC President Brandon Stoddard offered the producers a prime tryout slot for spring 1986, sandwiched between two established hits, Who's the Boss? And Moonlighting, on Tuesday nights. The show premiered on March 25, 1986, and the entire first season ran just 6 episodes, barely enough to count as a season by normal television standards. It worked anyway. The show found an audience fast enough to land a full second season that fall, moving to Wednesday nights in prime time before eventually becoming a Friday night anchor, and later, a cornerstone of ABC's TGIF comedy block. For a brand new concept built around a fictional island and a character named Bartokomous, turning a 6-episode audition into an 8-season, 150-episode run is a genuinely rare outcome in network television. Think about what that timeline actually demanded behind the scenes. Episodes were rehearsed and taped in a fraction of the usual lead time, with barely any cushion between writing, shooting, and broadcast. Most shows given that kind of compressed runway either get quietly canceled or limp along until a fall slot frees up. Instead, Perfect Strangers used the pressure to its advantage, building momentum episode by episode until ABC had no real choice but to keep it around. You'd assume a name like Balki Bartokomous was dreamed up by a writer's room after weeks of brainstorming. The real story is smaller and stranger. Pinchot told TV Guide in 1986 that Balki was short for balcony, a name his family had once considered giving his sister's dog when they were kids. The family ultimately named the dog something else, but the nickname stuck in Pinchot's memory, and he offered it up when producers were trying to land on a name for his new character. It's a strange bit of trivia because it means one of the most recognizable sitcom character names of the 1980s started as a rejected dog name from someone's childhood, filed away for years until it needed a second life. Even more amusingly, Balki wasn't even the character's first proposed name once the show got into development. Earlier planning documents reportedly floated the name Vev before Pinchot's dog-adjacent suggestion won out. There's something fitting about that origin story once you consider the character himself. Balki was a man defined by small, deeply personal traditions that made perfect sense to him and almost none to anyone else. Customs from Mypos, family sayings, a whole private logic system he never questioned. A character name pulled from a half-remembered family joke about a family pet fits right into that pattern, even if nobody involved in naming him was thinking about it that way at the time. The dance of joy, the bouncing, chanting celebration Balki would launch whenever something wonderful happened, is one of the most recognizable bits in 80s sitcom history. And according to both actors, it was never really scripted. The direction on the page simply called for the characters to perform the dance, without spelling out choreography or specific movements. Pinchot and Linn-Baker filled in the blank themselves, on the spot, relying on the same kind of instinctive, shared comic timing that made their whole partnership work. That kind of improvisation only functions when two performers can read each other completely, which is exactly what these two could do. Early versions of the bit were looser and less defined, but as the show found its footing across the first couple of seasons, the routine sharpened into something audiences could recognize instantly, almost like a piece of punctuation the writers could drop into any script and trust the actors to land. The bit became such a signature of the show that decades later, fans at conventions still asked the pair to perform it. and they still do, without hesitation, because the muscle memory apparently never faded. It's a rare example of a running gag that started as an afterthought in a script and ended up defining an entire show's public identity more than any single line of dialogue ever did. Balki wasn't originally meant to hail from a made-up island. Early drafts floated making him Greek, which would have offered a built-in fish-out-of-water premise, using a real culture and a real place. But the moment a character is tied to an actual country, a show inherits real obligations, cultural accuracy, sensitivity, and a level of scrutiny that limits how far the writers can stretch a joke. So the creative team invented Mypos instead, a fictional Mediterranean island with its own customs and its own internal logic. That decision gave the writers a blank check, and they used it constantly. Balki would casually reference bizarre Myposian customs and traditions the same way someone else might mention the weather. Arranged marriages, unusual greetings, elaborate food rituals, all delivered completely straight, as though nothing about it was the least bit unusual. Once the writers had a fictional country to play with, nearly every episode found a new way to lean on it, and the audience never seemed to tire of learning one more strange detail about life on Mypos. The approach also gave the show a kind of narrative insulation that a real-world setting couldn't have offered. Because Mypos didn't exist, nothing Balki said about it could be checked against reality, which meant the writers were free to escalate a joke as far as it needed to go, without ever worrying that a punchline might land as an actual claim about a real place or its people. For most of the show's run, Pinchot and Linn-Baker threw themselves into physical comedy with total commitment, which meant that occasionally the comedy hit back. During a 1988 taping of an episode built around an assertiveness exercise, Pinchot's character grabs Linn-Baker's character by the shoulders, shoves him backward, then pulls him forward. On the first take, in front of a live studio audience, their heads collided for real. The impact left Linn-Baker with a stitch and Pinchot needing a root canal after the collision knocked a tooth into his co-star's forehead. Because it was the very first take, the studio audience had no idea what the scene was supposed to look like in the first place, so they couldn't tell the difference between choreographed chaos and an actual accident. Both men went straight to the emergency room after the taping wrapped. It's a strange footnote for a show built almost entirely on the idea that nothing bad ever really happens to Balki and Larry, except, apparently, once, very briefly, it did. What makes the story stick is how ordinary the scene itself was supposed to be. This wasn't a stunt sequence or an elaborate set piece. It was two guys in an office, doing a scripted physical beat they'd rehearsed dozens of times in other forms across the series. It's a reminder that even well-drilled physical comedy carries real risk, and that the two actors' commitment to selling every bit as convincingly as possible occasionally came with a genuine cost. Not long after the show premiered, Lucille Ball, one of the most influential figures in the entire history of American television comedy, took notice. When Perfect Strangers returned for its second season in the fall of 1986, Ball told the press that both actors were doing wonderful work, adding a short, warm line about how much she liked the pair. Pinchot has described the encounter as one of the most meaningful moments of his early career, comparing the experience to receiving praise from a legendary artist he deeply admired. It made sense given what the show was actually doing. At a time when a lot of sitcoms leaned into topical, issue-driven storylines, Perfect Strangers leaned hard into old-fashioned, physical, character-driven comedy, the kind of style Ball had built an entire career around. Both actors have said they saw the show as a spiritual cousin to I Love Lucy and The Honeymooners, and Ball apparently recognized that lineage the moment she watched it. For two relatively new performers, still finding their footing on network television, hearing that kind of validation from someone whose career had essentially defined the medium's earliest years was an unusually powerful moment, and it's one both actors have referenced in interviews for decades afterward. It also underlines something the show rarely got enough credit for at the time. Underneath the fictional island and the goofy accent, Perfect Strangers was doing a very old, very difficult kind of comedy well, and one of the people best qualified to notice that immediately did. Perfect Strangers had a habit of casting people who'd go on to much bigger things, long before anyone realized it. Belita Moreno actually played two different characters across the show's run. Edwina Twincasetti in the early seasons, then advice columnist Lydia Markham later on. Ernie Sabella played landlord Donald Twinkie Cassetti for the first 2 seasons before leaving to become the voice of Pumbaa across the entire Lion King franchise. Sam Anderson, who spent years as the perpetually irritated mailroom supervisor Mr. Gorpley, went on to play Principal DeWitt on Growing Pains, dentist Bernard Nadler on Lost, and the school principal in Forrest Gump, along with dozens of other guest roles across a career that stretched into the 2020s. He's the kind of character actor whose face you recognize instantly even when his name doesn't ring a bell. A genuine journeyman who quietly worked his way through nearly every major television drama of the following 3 decades. And then there's Jo Marie Payton, the elevator operator whose small supporting role turned into something nobody expected. Which brings us to the next fact. In its 3rd season, Perfect Strangers shifted its setting from the discount store to the Chicago Chronicle newspaper, introducing a new cast of coworkers. Among them was Harriet Winslow, an elevator operator played by Jo Marie Payton, written as a minor supporting character meant to fill out a scene. The character proved strong enough that her world kept expanding. Her police officer husband Carl was introduced, and by 1989, Harriet had her own spin-off, Family Matters. What followed wasn't a modest spin-off quietly finding its footing. Family Matters ran for 9 seasons, introduced Jaleel White's Steve Urkel, a character who took over both the show and a huge chunk of early 90s pop culture, and ultimately outlasted its parent series by several years. Neither show ever featured a direct on-screen crossover, though Pinchot and Linn-Baker did film a cameo for the Family Matters pilot that ultimately never made it to air, and behind the scenes the 2 productions stayed closely linked. Footage of the Chicago Chronicle building shot for Perfect Strangers even turned up in an early Family Matters episode, and music originally composed for the parent show was reused during its spin-off's first seasons. Small role, massive consequences. It's a genuinely unusual case of a background character, played by an actress hired to serve a single recurring scene, ending up as the foundation of an entirely separate television institution that ran well into the late 1990s. That harmonica-driven, unmistakably 80s theme song wasn't a one-off. It was written by Jesse Frederick and Bennett Salve, a songwriting duo who went on to define the sound of an entire era of ABC comedy, later composing themes for Full House, Family Matters, and Step by Step. Perfect Strangers was their very first television title track, and the tone they landed on, hopeful, slightly cheesy, completely sincere, became a kind of house style for the network's whole TGIF block. The voice actually singing the theme wasn't either of the composers. It was performed by David Pomerantz, a working songwriter whose voice ended up soundtracking a decade's worth of Friday nights for millions of households, without most viewers ever learning his name. The lyrics leaned all the way into that earnest, hopeful register the era was known for, framing 2 guys moving into a modest Chicago apartment as though it were the beginning of something enormous, and somehow the show never once undercut that sincerity, even as the scripts themselves got sillier by the season. It's genuinely rare for a theme song to outlive the show it was written for in the public's memory, but Perfect Strangers, Full House, and Family Matters all managed it, largely because Frederick and Salve understood exactly how to make a 30-second piece of music feel like a warm, familiar promise before a single line of dialogue was spoken. Most canceled sitcoms settle into a quiet afterlife of reruns and nostalgic rewatches. Perfect Strangers took a stranger route. HBO's The Leftovers, a series built around a fictional global event called The Sudden Departure, the sudden, simultaneous disappearance of 2% of the world's population, quietly established within its story that the entire cast of Perfect Strangers had vanished in the event, with one notable exception. Mark Linn-Baker, it turned out, had faked his own disappearance. By the show's 3rd season, Linn-Baker appeared as a fictionalized version of himself, the sole survivor of the Perfect Strangers cast, dealing with the guilt of having faked his departure while everyone he worked with vanished. The episode, memorably, borrowed its title from one of Balki's signature catchphrases, a playful, upbeat line repurposed into the name of an episode wrestling with grief and survivors' guilt on one of television's bleakest dramas. A goofy 80s sitcom about a sheep-herding immigrant ended up, decades later, functioning as a genuinely unsettling plot device in one of the most acclaimed dramas of the 2010s, a connection almost nobody watching The Leftovers in real time would have expected. For longtime fans of the original show, The reference landed as something closer to a gut punch than a joke, precisely because it took a piece of pure comfort television and repurposed it inside a story about loss on an almost unimaginable scale. It's the kind of pop culture afterlife that no amount of planning could have engineered. Bronson Pinchot and Mark Linn-Baker are still close, and it isn't a performance for the cameras. In interviews promoting Beverly Hills Cop,